Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Andrew Gustafson, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. We're really excited to actually be out in the field. I'm not out in the field, but my colleague Doug is going to be riding on the South Brooklyn Ferry. So this is the second in a series of programs that we're doing about the different routes of the New York City Ferry. And we'll go over the route and what we're going to see and share along the way. And I'm going to be joined as well by my colleague, Stefan. And the three of us are going to have a conversation about what we can see from the water and the history and contemporary story of the South Brooklyn waterfront. First, our person in the field, Doug Chapman, to say hello before he hops on the ferry.
Hi, Andrew.
Just
get my. There we go. All right.
Hey, Doug, how's it going?
Hey, Andrew, I'm so good. I'm so good. A little windy, a little breezy out here, but I'm looking forward to the trip down. So I don't know if you can see me behind me, but the ferry is just arriving there.
Yeah.
That's what I'll
be
getting on.
You're at the Corlears Hook stop, right?
I'm at the Corlears Hook stop, yeah. And
okay.
In Lower East Side of Manhattan, yeah. So
great.
And the ferry's just arrived. So why don't I get on there and see you on board?
Get on board and get situated.
Fantastic.
And we'll come back to you in just a couple minutes.
All right, sounds good, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Okay, all right. So now I want to bring on our other studio guest, Stefan, who is going to be discussing what we see from Doug's camera. How's it going, Stefan?
It's going really well. How are you, Andrew?
Good, good. And where are you joining us from?
I'm in Flushing, Queens, not yet on the ferry system, nor likely to be, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Maybe someday. They used to have a ferry that ran to Citi Field for baseball games. So there is some precedent for ferries going to Flushing Bay. I myself, I should say, I'm actually not even in New York City. We are up in Vermont after a lengthy quarantine. We came up here to get away for a little bit, but we'll be back in the city in too soon. But anyway, yeah. So we are going to be exploring the ferry system. So again, I know we have a lot of people who aren't even from New York City. So thanks to everybody for sharing in the chat. We have some people here from California. I know we have some people from Austria as well who are joining us. Paul is joining us from Washington, D.C. So I think it might be useful to give people a little bit of background on the NYC ferry system, because this is a relatively new innovation, although ferries have a long history in New York City because it's essentially a city of islands.
Yep, we're getting back to our roots, not just the Staten Island ferry.
Right. So I'm going to pull up a map here, and we can sort of give you a preview of where we're going to be going. Can you see that okay, Stefan?
It looks great.
Okay, great. Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we had the opportunity to work with Open House New York, and we did a tour of the Astoria route, which you can see in orange here. So we went from Wall Street all the way up to East 90th Street along the East River. Now we're going to look at a completely different corner of the city, where we're starting here at Corlears Hook. So we're going to be following this yellow route, or the South Brooklyn route. So we're going to go to Corlears Hook, and we're going to, for the first couple stops, we're going to zigzag back and forth between Manhattan and Brooklyn. So we'll go to Corlears Hook, then to Dumbo, then back to Wall Street, and then make our way down the South Brooklyn shoreline with stops in Brooklyn Bridge Park, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and then we're going to end at Bay Ridge. So just so folks know that the ferry is scheduled to come in right around 1:05 or so, but we're going to go a little bit longer than an hour. So I think we have this scheduled for an hour and 15 minutes. Just, I know people expect that most of our programs will be about an hour. So we're going to go a little bit longer today. Yeah. So Stefan, why don't we talk a little bit about the spot where we're starting at Corlears Hook? What's the significance of this place?
Well, historically, in terms of the waterfront, particularly Corlears Hook, is one of the more significant places in New York. This was the center of shipbuilding in New York from the 18th century through to the mid to late 19th century. Basically, when shipbuilding transitioned to steel, Corlears Hook, the work there, they never retooled for steel. That a lot of that work ended up happening in Philadelphia. This was wooden ships built in Corlears Hook for well over 100 years.
Yeah, and so we can see this is a map from 1879 showing Corlears Hook. So it's that bend, right in the sort of the rump of the Lower East Side, that bend in the East River there. And so this is 1879. You can see that that most of the shipyards that would have dotted this shore have by this time started to disappear. You can see a few more a little bit further to the south on the left-hand side. But there are still a couple interesting things you can spot on this map, right, along the shore.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, all kinds of things to be seen here we've got the dry docks down at the left end there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a little bit of Brooklyn Navy Yard right across the East River.
Yep.
And the ships themselves that we see here, a lot of the ships that are depicted here are almost certainly wood hulls, along with canal boats being towed by tugboats. There's a lot going on in this image.
Yeah. And yeah, I love these. We have these floating dry docks down here along South Street. So we still have, even though shipbuilding has sort of shifted across the river into Brooklyn by this point, you still have a very, very active waterfront. And we can see a little bit further down. We'll come back to this image because we're going to be going down to Lower Manhattan. But you can also see a number of different ferry slips going back and forth across the river. I love how this image is from 1879, but it would be another 4 years before they actually complete the Brooklyn Bridge. But you can see it here on the map already. So they were anticipating that. So why don't we cut over to Doug and see what we can see from the water. Hey Doug, how's it going?
All right.
So we just pulled out here.
So there we are.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, I'm just going to get us so everybody can get the best view of Doug's image here. So I will also just add a caveat here that the cell phone network was not necessarily designed to be out on the water. So we may get some spots where we have less than perfect reception. It's also, we have to give Doug a round of applause because it is not the nicest day to be out on the water, but he's braving the cold and the wind. But you can see we're coming down here. We're coming down the East River here, about to come underneath the Manhattan Bridge. Maybe Doug, you can turn a little bit to your left so we can see more of the Brooklyn shoreline.
Yep, now there we go.
There we go, great. So there's a building I want to point out here, which is, you can see that big glass structure. So a lot of new construction in the DUMBO neighborhood. You can see there's two sort of glass fronted buildings. The one on the left is actually a historic building with a new facade. The one on the right is new, but you can see that little building that's just tucked right underneath or just to the left of the Manhattan Bridge right there. It's one of my favorite, most interesting little buildings in DUMBO. It's 135 Plymouth Street. And I'm going to pull up some pictures so we can get a better view of the building here. As we pass by. So I'm going to pull up some historic images here. So what that is called it was the Bliss Building. E.W. Bliss was a leading manufacturer of machine tools. And so they made equipment for sheet metal stamping equipment, essentially. And from that, they started to actually manufacture their own products. One of the principal products being torpedoes. They were actually the leading torpedo manufacturer from the 1890s up until World War I. And their torpedoes were actually used all the way up until early in the Second World War. And so they actually had factories across Brooklyn, but this was their main facility. This building is interesting. If you look at it actually from the Manhattan Bridge, if you're going over the bike path, you can see down that it's actually a building within a building. So it's sort of a square donut with another building inside. And it was in that inner building where they actually assembled this explosive components of those torpedoes. So in case anything went off, it would actually, the outer part of the building would absorb that whole explosion. But Bliss is actually a person we're going to talk about later on. So it's one of the very first stops on the tour. It's actually also going to be one of the very last stops on the tour, because we're going to see where his big manor estate that he constructed down in Bay Ridge was located. So the Bliss Building, 135 Plymouth, is today now an apartment building. For a long time, it was actually a live-work building. So there were artists that lived in there. And over time, it's been converted to market rate rental apartments. There's still one or two working artists that still live in the building and have their studios in there. But really, really interesting spot, and I think a pretty attractive looking building. So here's just an image, so you can see where we're coming. So Doug is just coming in now to Pier 1, which is right here, and the Bliss Building is sort of just beyond the Manhattan Bridge over here. You can see the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge right here, and of course, again, Stefan, all of this barge traffic.
That's right. Yeah, of course, being on a city of islands, that's how we connect with the rest of the world, is used to by barges before there were highways and to connect us, which we've talked about a lot in some of our programs in the past. It looks like Doug has come into the ferry stop. We've got
so let's take a look.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, I'm gonna remove my spot. Hey Doug, how's it going?
I'm okay. Can you see? There we go.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we can see you okay. You just got to flip it around.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, so now we are here at Pier 1 in Dumbo. You can't talk about the story of ferries in New York City without talking about this place, which is the Fulton Landing. And so this is where there historically was a sail and row powered ferry that went back and forth between Brooklyn and Manhattan. But in 1814, this became the spot of the first steam powered ferry in the United States, created, of course, by Robert Fulton, and really allowed Brooklyn to transform from sort of the agricultural hinterland of New York City across the river into a full-fledged suburb and a full-fledged, industrial urban center of its own. Yeah.
And with warehousing, a lot of the buildings we're going to be seeing are we've just been passing are old warehouses. Proximity to Wall Street was important. Having the access to the waterfront and being close to the Verrazano Narrows was important. So this whole area, the great walled city walled with warehouses.
Yeah. So we had a couple questions here. So Alan asks about a spot that we were looking at on the other side of the river, which is East River Park. He says, do you know about the plans to close East River Park as part of the plan to raise the shoreline, and how this will affect the area of the ferry stop? That's a good question. I don't know how it's going to affect the ferry. It is going to affect East River Park, as there are plans to build essentially a berm. We did a program actually about this section or this sort of sea level rise mitigation project a little bit further to the south, but we didn't touch on the East River Park section of it. Do you know anything more about the plans and how it might affect the ferry, Stefan?
What I feel certain about the plans is that there's a lot of uncertainty. So whether between the park closure itself and the ferry as well. So.
Yep. Yep. All right.
But
So
we're looking
going
at some
out.
really great stuff right here. We've got an old barge, one of those barges that we were pointing out in the photos. There are a couple of old barges here. The one on the left that we're looking at is the River Cafe. It's been there since the early 80s. And then on the right, we saw a moment ago, and we'll see again here, barge music. Which is an old steel barge that was converted in the early 80s into a chamber music performance space. There are big windows that you can see at the end of the barge facing Manhattan, and a nice parquetry stage in front of the windows, and the audience watches chamber music performances with a gorgeous backdrop, and in between them, an old firehouse.
And so you have a personal connection to barge music, is that right?
I do, yeah. When I was back in the dark ages, when I was an intern with WNYC, we did live broadcasts from barge music, and we would run the cables off the barge. And unless it was a really nice day and we could set up our equipment, the boards out on the pier, we would set our soundboards up in the firehouse on the second floor and watch the barges come down the East River and make a big wake, and wait for the wake to hit the barge music and see how the cellists adjusted to the bouncing barge.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so cool. So Doug, maybe you can turn back to DUMBO for a second here. What's so interesting about these two barges that are really sort of institutions in DUMBO, barge music and the River Cafe, is that this area, DUMBO, was really, the industrial heartland of Brooklyn, and started to go into decline really in the 1960s. And by the 70s and 80s, it had, become really kind of hollowed out. There were still, a fair amount of industry, but not nearly on the scale that it had been. And what's interesting is that both of these places opened at a time that was sort of like the low point for this neighborhood. These were not neighborhoods that you came to eat at a, fancy French restaurant or go to see classical music. But they sort of stepped in and they've endured now for, more than 40 years, which I think it's really interesting. You would think that these were places that came along, in the late 90s, early 2000s when DUMBO started to gentrify, but they actually long predate that transformation.
Yeah. Marilyn was asking about barge music as a coffee barge. And yeah, that definitely is that how barge music self-identifies. Coffee, of course, was a huge import for New York, both for the Arbuckle roasting company in what we now call DUMBO, and also over in Jersey City, there was roasting happening as well. But lots of barges carried coffee. I've read some indication that some barges were somewhat specialized for coffee, but we'll see a barge a little bit later that coffee beans have been found in the seams and in between the planks in that barge. So it's definitely, there was enough coffee coming into New York that any barge would do to get the sacks of coffee moved around New York.
Yeah, I see we have a question here actually about the view. So we have, let's see here. Hopefully that improves the view so you now get the full view of Doug. Apologies for that. So we had a question about tugboats and barges. So why is it that all the commercial traffic that we see on the East River is barges being pushed by tugboats and not big ships coming up the East River?
It's very rare that you'll see any traffic in New York Harbor without a tugboat attached to it, aside from a small, highly maneuverable vessel such as a ferry. If you'll see a large ship traveling up and down the East River, which is rare but happens, they'll have tugboats helping them to maneuver. It's simply difficult to maneuver a large ship, but a lot of what you see in the harbor today and historically has been what we call lighterage, where we are taking materials off of a large ship, from one place in the harbor, putting them on a barge and moving them around the harbor through that much more maneuverable and less expensive piece of vessel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and historically, the the East River, going all the way back to 1883 has had this big obstacle, which is the Brooklyn Bridge. So even back in the age of sail, it was an obstacle for a lot of ships getting up there. So really the East River waterfront on Manhattan and Brooklyn was developed largely for barges and not necessarily for big ocean going ships. That would really develop along the shoreline that we're going to see on this program, which is the South Brooklyn waterfront, as well as the Hudson River side of Manhattan. So Doug's going to show us a little bit of Lower Manhattan. So we are now at Wall Street, Pier 11. And what Doug is looking at in front of us is the South Street Seaport Museum.
Yeah, we see those masts sticking up there, sort of in the center of your picture. That's the Waver Tree, a ship that was built in Liverpool and was part of the commerce of New York. Just basically a big hole in the water pushed by the wind, but they sort of an icon of their collection over there.
Yeah, I actually don't know the height of the masts of the Waver Tree, if it would fit underneath the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely something for us to look at today.
So just so you know that the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge are all roughly the same height, which is about 135 feet above the mean high tide. And it's something we've talked about in the past, that this posed a challenge for about 80 years for ships coming into and out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
It sounds like we have Judy is asking a question about 120 Wall Street, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah. So Doug, maybe you could turn to your left and we can take a look at that historic wedding cake building right there.
No, a little too far.
Oh, a little too far. He's gonna get a better position.
I suspect it's this one.
Yep. Yeah, right there.
120 Wall Street, built in 1930, finished in 1930, along with a lot of other iconic buildings. And for a long time, it was really the only tall building on the East River waterfront.
Yeah, because again, this was mostly industrial, and the financial district was a little bit further up the hill. Now it's sort of bled all the way down to the East River waterfront, and people often wonder about the shape. So that wedding cake design, it was typical of that period between 1916 with the New York City zoning resolution and then the reform of it in 1961, which is basically the zoning resolution we still live with today. But that wedding cake design was a way to build taller. You step back further from the street to allow light to get down to the street. So that wedding cake design is typical of that sort of mid-century era.
And Cindy was asking if that's the Woolworth building we see behind it. I believe what you're seeing behind that is 70 Pine, which
that's right.
Yeah. And
we can't quite see the Woolworth building from here. I can see a little bit of the municipal building, and the Woolworth is right around the corner from there. So yeah. We did a program about the architect of the Woolworth building, Cass Gilbert, last week. So we talked about a lot of his work in Lower Manhattan, which used to dominate the skyline. The Woolworth building was the tallest building in the world when it was constructed, and now it's dwarfed by all the buildings in Lower Manhattan.
So we're back on water, heading over Diamond Reef, heading back to Buttermilk Channel.
Well, if we look back at the Brooklyn Bridge, Doug, if you don't mind for a second, you can see that one lone building sticking up, right in the sort of middle of the span of the Brooklyn Bridge right there. So that's One Manhattan Plaza, which is sort of right in Chinatown, right next to the Manhattan Bridge. And it really kind of dominates the skyline. There have been plans to build 3 more similar height skyscrapers around there, but they've run into some issues because it's land that's set aside for senior housing. But very, very divisive building right there.
I can't tell you that I've heard many people speak positively of it, frankly.
Right. Right. All right. Yeah. So let's take a look back at the Buttermilk Channel that we're heading into. And here we can see Brooklyn Bridge Park. So Brooklyn Bridge Park is a relatively new development, really within the last 15 years along the waterfront. I talked about the decline of industry in DUMBO. We also saw the decline of the use of these piers here north of Atlantic Avenue. And so they were taken over by the city and transformed into this park. And yeah, so Stefan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this section of piers, sort of Pier 1 to Pier 6, and what it was used for.
Well, these piers were ultimately developed by and owned by New York Dock Company. They were the major landholder on the waterfront in the late 19th, early 20th century. By the 1930s, and into the 50s, the city had begun redeveloping these piers, and the Port Authority had been redeveloping these piers. As we leave, we'll see that there are some of the old sheds that are still functioning as piers. You can just see the remnants of the pier sheds here, the sort of the framing that surrounds the landscaping inside this pier here. And of course, these piers were all built on wooden pilings, which have had to be replaced in recent years since they've been collapsing as we passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, and within 20 years, our shipworms had come back along with other organisms that love living in the harbor, and they've been destroying anything wood in the salt water. So these piers have been through a lot, but this was where Brooklyn really happened. This was where the industry met the world. You'd have barges mooring here to have goods transferred to take them to trains in New Jersey. You'd have ships mooring here to take goods to and from the rest of the world. Beautiful image here looking.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show this so people can see the scale of the New York Dock Company, which really extended from Red Hook all the way to the Brooklyn Bridge. This dominant player in the early 20th century, and we're going to see many buildings of the New York Dock Company as we head south, so I'll pull this down now.
So here we are at Atlantic Avenue, and this is a once, and it used to be a ferry stop historically. So we're sort of restoring ferry service here with the NYC Ferry. But the streetcar came down here, the ferry stopped here, and you could connect from anywhere in Brooklyn to Manhattan. Yeah.
And used to be the terminus of the Long Island Railroad as well. So if you wanted to actually travel to Boston, you would get on the station near here and take it out to the end of Long Island, and then take a ferry into New England and then go up to Boston. All facilitated by the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, which if anyone had the opportunity during the period when you could actually visit it, was a pretty amazing place. But yeah, we're here.
See a functioning warehouse, a covered pier that's still functioning there with a couple of tugs and a Bouchard labeled, at least a articulated tug barge unit there, which we learned about on our program a couple of weeks ago with Jonathan Atkin, the ship shooter. Bouchard's an interesting company. They got their start following a tragedy in New York back in 1916, basically directly across the harbor from where we are right now. You can almost see the spot. There was an island behind the Statue of Liberty called Black Tom Island, which was a major depot for armaments going over to Europe for World War I. And German saboteurs set a fire, caused a huge explosion. And Captain Bouchard was in a tugboat working for another company over at Erie Basin, saw the explosion, and he's one of those people who, when he sees a danger, runs toward it to help. And he rescued a couple of vessels from that location and was awarded salvage awards for it, and used that money to start the Bouchard Company, moving petroleum products.
So this is one of the sort of the young upstarts in New York City's tug and barge community. because a lot of them were started in the middle of the 19th century. And so Bouchard being just a little over 100 years old makes it one of the newer ones.
Yeah, now McAllister goes back to the Erie Canal. Hughes, which we'll see a lot of Hughes barges later, they started out working on the Delaware and Raritan Canal.
Yep. So you can see here, now that Doug has gone to the other side, that Atlantic Avenue is sort of this dividing line between our working waterfront and our recreational waterfront here on the border of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Doug, if you could go to the left a little bit, I wanted to take a look at the building that's actually in Brooklyn Bridge Park. So you can see this glass tower. So this is a new building. And then just behind it is we have One Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is actually one of the New York Dock Company refrigerated warehouses. And that was what a lot of the buildings were along this waterfront before the park was built. Most of the other ones were torn down. This one was kept, and it's actually within the footprint of the park. And now it's condominium building. But you know, the way that Brooklyn Bridge Park was developed, the model was to actually do it as a public-private partnership and develop buildings within the footprint of the park, and then the money that those buildings generate, whether it's housing or there's actually a hotel within the borders of the park as well, would help to support the park construction and maintenance. And there is ongoing construction and maintenance, like you mentioned before, Stefan. One of the biggest costs is shoring up these piers because of the infiltration of shipworms. So they're kind of hard to see along here, but you know, every single one of those piles, thousands and thousands of them, were made of wood, and so they had to be reinforced with concrete. So you may see some barges going around the harbor carrying some interesting cargo, which I want to pull up here.
See, Cindy's mentioning some of the great things you can do near Atlantic Avenue, and I also want to shout out to the Maritime Heritage folks at Summer Ops who have historic ships, one often moored there in Brooklyn Bridge Park, where you can get on board a historic ship and enjoy oysters and everything else.
So here we can see at one of the piers in Brooklyn Bridge Park, these barges, and you can see these kind of plastic tubes that they're carrying along. Those are sort of the sheets that they'll stick into around sort of a collar that'll go around those wooden piles, and then they'll pour concrete into it. So it'll reinforce it, but it can cost tens of thousands of dollars per pile to do this, because it requires not just the barges and the concrete, but also divers to actually go down there and install it and inspect it. So let's cut back to Doug as he's seeing more of these working piers here and the container terminal.
Absolutely, real important piece of infrastructure for Brooklyn. This is, this was Brooklyn's bid to get in on the containerization, the rise of containerization in the 70s and 80s, but it's proved to be especially important now because our highways are so congested. And while we do have roads that link Brooklyn to the rest of the world, they're very congested. So one way of dealing with that, getting around the congestion, is to take containers off of the big ships that come into Newark and put them on barges to come over here. But we do also have ships that bring containers to Brooklyn as well, as we see here.
Yeah, so this is a ship that has come in from the Dominican Republic. So a lot of the shipping and the ship companies that operate out of the Red Hook Container Terminal work in the Caribbean. So we get ships that come in from, primarily Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they offload here. But we also get ships that come from Europe and other parts of the world as well. It's obviously a much smaller terminal than we have over in Staten Island or in New Jersey. And it also has the disadvantage of being the only container terminal in New York Harbor that does not have a rail connection. So every container that comes off of these ships either has to go onto a truck or it might go onto a barge and be lightered across the harbor to the ports in New Jersey. But yeah, so these container cranes are still working. So you can see most of the time you see them in their upward position when they're not working, but like right there, but you can see over the ship, they lower down, and so they can be positioned perpendicular to the ship and lift those container cranes off, lift those containers off.
So here
So
we are
what's this
entering
little-
Atlantic
yeah.
Basin. Yeah, this Atlantic Basin, very significant place in New York's maritime history. This was built in the 1840s and built expressly for the traffic on the Erie Canal. So this was a major depot for grain, which was the primary commodity carried on the Erie Canal. The canal boats would get to Albany and then be rafted together and brought towed down to New York. And here, there was, after the invention of the grain elevator, pretty shortly after the invention of the grain elevator, by 1847, there were 7 grain elevators in this basin, moving grain from those canal boats and then depositing it on ships to go overseas.
And so those grain elevators, were those all on land, or were some of those floating grain elevators?
The ones in Atlantic Basin were based on land. A lot of the grain in New York Harbor was moved by floating grain elevators. New York, Manhattan didn't get a terrestrial grain elevator until 1861. And until that time, and quite a while after that time, a lot of the grain that was transferred in Manhattan was done through floating grain elevators, which are just wild looking, strange ships.
Yeah. I'm just going to pull up this image real quick so people can get a view of what Atlantic Basin looked like. So again, this is around 1916.
Yep.
So you can see there used to be a number of several more piers that jutted out into the basin. Today, we basically just have this rectangle here, and you can also see the warehouses have changed as well along the border, and some of them are still warehouses. Some of them are now used for different purposes. But maybe we can take a look at some of those. Yeah, and you're familiar with some of the boats that we're seeing in the basin here as well, Stefan.
Very much so. So we just passed the old tug, 1950 Lehigh Valley Railroad tug Cornell, there behind the sailboat on the left. And then the larger vessel here with the bowsprit, that is the Clipper City, which does excursions in normal times off the Battery. And I believe that's Shearwater in front of it, which also does excursions. And the black hull coming in on the right is the Mary A. Whalen, ex-St. Cadieux, a tiny oil tanker that now serves as the centerpiece of Portside, New York, a community organization that is involved in a lot of activities supporting the neighborhood of Red Hook, which is where we are, but also preserving our maritime history.
Yeah, and the great thing about it is it's sort of this great public space in the midst of this working waterfront, and they've been doing a lot of programming throughout the pandemic. So they've turned the sort of parking lot in warmer months into a little picnic area. They again, in warmer months, they have times called tanker time, where you can come and sit on a hammock and read a book or do some work on your computer on the deck of this old ship.
And in normal times, Red Hook is just full of things to do. Right behind where we see the Portside, New York, the Mary Whalen is Pioneer Works, a major arts center. And of course, there are galleries and restaurants all up and down Van Brunt Street. And the Red Hook is a place full of history going back to the Revolution and before. This was all marshes until, in fact, there were marshes that still in Red Hook into the 20th century, though much of the marshland got filled in by the end of the 19th. And there was a Fort Defiance, that we'll pass its location fairly soon, which played a part in the Revolutionary War. Just a really remarkable place, one that's changing rapidly and well worth a visit.
So speaking of changes, Doug, if you could turn a little bit to the right, you're going to see 2 buildings that are sort of twins.
Just
A little bit further to the left, Doug.
The tall one.
Sort of see the one with windows. Yep, and a sort of cream-colored one further in the distance. So these were both warehouses for New York Dock Company, and if we were closer, we'd actually be able to see New York Dock Company inscribed on the side of them. The one on the left is still a warehouse of sorts, in that it is a storage warehouse for Christie's auction house. So they're probably, billion with a B dollars worth of art that's stored in there. And then to the right, they've actually cut out all of the sort of concrete panels. Doug's just gonna have to reposition a little bit as the ferry turns around. But that building has been redeveloped as condominiums, so you can live in an old warehouse, either here or over in Brooklyn Bridge Park, both legacies of the New York Dock Company.
It bears mentioning, of course, that a lot of the areas we're looking at, basically all the areas we're looking at, were devastated in Superstorm Sandy. We're looking at areas that were marshland for the most part, and rule of thumb is most places that were marshland originally were inundated during Superstorm Sandy. That's one aspect of the many changes that these neighborhoods are seeing, is adjusting for that, trying to get ahead of the next storm and make our city more resilient.
Yeah, and of course, we talked about this in our last program about how the waterfront was industrial, or it was marginal land, not a desirable place to live. And so throughout the middle of the 20th century, this is where we built most of our public housing. And so one of the largest public housing developments in the city is in Red Hook. And that really was devastated by Hurricane Sandy. One of the hardest hit communities for sure, and one of the poorest communities in New York City as well, that had to bear the brunt of the impacts of that storm, and had to wait months and months to get power and water back.
What I find interesting about Red Hook is its consistency. It has this great history of shipping and warehousing, and that continues through to today. We're about to pass a few locations that are being redeveloped as modern warehousing for our sort of final mile economy, with all the boxes that are being sent to everyone's doors these days.
Yes, the positive and the negative of that. So we have a lot of cargo going through Red Hook, but it's not containers or bags of grain coming in on ships. It is, Amazon boxes that might just have 2 AA batteries. Shipped halfway across.
Packed, with a lot of packing around those batteries.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So that's right. So a lot of different, a lot of companies, including Amazon, but also UPS and other logistics companies have created footprints in Red Hook and Sunset Park over the last couple of years. Is sort of an unknown story, really, of the South Brooklyn waterfront. Before we turn back to the South Brooklyn waterfront, though, I just wanted to see, I know the reception isn't great, but I want to point out what you're looking at here, which is Governor's Island. So Doug is heading down the Buttermilk Channel right here, which is the channel that runs between Brooklyn and Governor's Island. The island has a long association with the military. It was an early fort for harbor defense, and it was an army base all the way up until 1966, when then the Coast Guard took it over and operated it for 30 years. So the military was there for almost 200 years. And now it's owned by the city and is being redeveloped as parkland and other sort of public uses. There's a high school that's on the island called the Harbor School, which we've mentioned in the past. But yeah, interesting spot. And if you have any questions.
The project, which is working to restore the water quality of the harbor with 1 billion oysters to filter all that water. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. So now we're back at Red Hook, and we can see a little bit of some of the historic piers. Red Hook is one of those places where those early, mill building style warehouses have survived.
Absolutely. Yeah, we see some here. The everything's a little bit in silhouette right now, but the shape that's dominating our screen right now, that was William Beard's warehouse, famously home to a Fairway supermarket for quite a while. And right in front of it is not really something you can pick out right now, but there is the 1914 Lightridge barge from the Lehigh Valley Railroad, the Lehigh Valley 79, which we did a program on, God, 9 months ago.
Yeah.
Almost.
So let's take a look at both of those things. So there you can see the waterfront museum in the foreground, and then in the background is that warehouse that was Fairway, which unfortunately has gone out of business.
They still have a grocery store. There's somebody,
it's still there,
new supermarket has stepped in and kept
groceries
coming into Red Hook. So yeah.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. So you can still see a lot of this, historic landscape in Red Hook, and a lot of that has been preserved just by having a somewhat magnanimous landlord, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Greg O'Connell came in here in the 90s when there was nothing, and got the land fairly cheap with the deal with the Port Authority, as these things go, and made a really strong commitment to preserving the history of the architecture and bringing in people with organizations like the Waterfront Museum, which we see on screen right now. And they've done quite well with that. There's, this is a great alternative for waterfront development that preserves our history and also develops the community. And yeah, this is, we're looking at images from just on the other side of that warehouse in Erie Basin, a really significant piece of waterfront infrastructure. Around the time of the Civil War, there was a big pier built out from the shore, creating a massive enclosure. This was a place that Erie Canal boats would overwinter. It was a place that they had, you could see barges here. There were dry docks in this space for repairing ships. There were graving docks, massive repair facilities for huge ships. And today we still do have barges that more in there, as you see here, the Hughes barges that we mentioned earlier. And we have IKEA, which has built their parking lot on top of those old graving docks.
Right.
And Erie Canal infrastructure there in the back, the white building with the black top, was built for the Erie Barge Canal in 1922, the giant grain elevator for Red Hook.
Which is sort of Brooklyn's white elephant.
Never made any money as a grain elevator, but it's a real icon for Brooklyn.
So another thing that you can go and check out, you can see it from a distance, but you can walk around this area if you want to take a little jaunt around Red Hook. Let's cut back to Doug and see what he is seeing here. So it looks like we've now passed Erie Basin and past the Gowanus Bay, and now we're looking at Sunset Park. And Sunset Park, when we talk about the development of the Brooklyn waterfront, for a long time that development sort of ended at Red Hook. Red Hook started to be developed, through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and then it's really not until the 1890s when we see significant development along the southern part of the waterfront in what's today known as Sunset Park, with the development of something called the Bush Terminal. So the Bush Terminal, they started building it in 1895. It took about 15 years to complete. And it really was the world's first intermodal shipping port. So sort of a prelude to containerization. This was creating one huge complex of piers and warehouses and factories and rail lines that would be sort of integrated into one complex. So you could easily move cargo from ships to rail and from rail to ships. So I know it's hard to see along the waterfront, but this is what it would have looked like at its peak. So you can see this whole series of piers and then the warehouses behind them, and then even larger warehouse and factory buildings behind that. So the Bush Terminal complex extended from 51st Street all the way up to 31st Street. And then this right here, this is 3rd Avenue. So this section over here on the left-hand side Today, you may know that as Industry City. So this sort of was broken off from the rest of Bush Terminal. Bush Terminal, really, continued to it's actually always had tenants in it, but it started to go into decline in the 1960s, along with the rest of New York City's working waterfront due to containerization. But this portion over here to the left, this is known as Industry City today. It's a privately owned development. And the portion that's closest to us is actually owned by the city of New York. The area that's along the shore, this is an industrial park called the Bush Terminal Industrial Park. And then the area, you won't find many of these piers here anymore. This is now a park. This is now called the Bush Terminal Park. So they've repurposed the footprints of these piers, which have collapsed and disappeared beneath the waves, thanks in large part to our friends, the shipworms. But today, this is now really a wonderful park and really one of the, it was much needed green space in the Sunset Park neighborhood, especially along the waterfront when it opened, I guess now about 4 or 5 years ago.
And you mentioned the tenants that were in Bush Terminals. I think that's notable. That these sorts of facilities were out there in a smaller scale, owned by individual companies. But the fact that Bush Terminals was open sort of in a WeWork style operation where you could, small businesses could take advantage of massive warehouse facilities was part of what made this revolutionary. Although I think your comparison on the timeline of containerization is apt as well.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too is that Bush, Irving T. Bush, the founder of it, wanted people to come out to Brooklyn, but he knew that for some people it was hard to get them to come out there, and so he had all of these small tenants. And so what he did was create office space for them in Midtown Manhattan. So right at 42nd Street and 6th Avenue, you'll find the Bush Tower, which was so office and showcase space, a place to show off everything that he was doing way out there in Brooklyn. And again, it used to be
a similar facility in London, Bush House,
that's
which
right.
was longtime home of the BBC.
Yeah, that's right. And so the Bush Tower used to be one of the skyscrapers of Midtown. Now it's completely dwarfed by all of the other buildings around it. You wouldn't even know that it was there if you didn't know what you were looking for.
Howie was asking where we're coming in at Sunset Park, and I bet he recognizes where we are now. This is the Sunset Park stop on the ferry is at the Brooklyn Army Terminal.
That's right. So this pier right here is the end of 58th Street. So we actually have a pretty big gap in the ferry line. It goes all the way from Atlantic Basin all the way here down to 58th Street. Historically, there actually was a ferry at 39th Street. And that was actually one of that helped to spur development in this area. It was actually created by a guy named John Wolfe Ambrose. And we've talked about the Ambrose Channel, which is the dredged channel that connects New York Harbor to the Atlantic Ocean. That was also his creation, although he didn't live to see it completed. But John Wolfe Ambrose also decided to develop a ferry route that went out to Sunset Park. But there wasn't really much to see or do out there when he opened it. So he's like, well, I guess we got to create things for people to do. So he built something called Ambrose Park, which was sort of this leading amphitheater of its day. And so they would bring in acts, including Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Spent at least a couple seasons out there. So take the ferry out there and you could watch the show. But we don't have a 39th Street ferry now. Maybe we will in the future, but
not yet.
Yeah, maybe we will in the future. But actually, that spot on 39th Street is still a section of working waterfront. It's where we have the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which we couldn't quite get a good view at. The ferry was a little bit too far from shore. But maybe someday we'll have that link restored. But yeah, we're coming into the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So this is a building that you can't miss on the waterfront. It's giant and painted, bright yellow. You can see it from miles and miles away. Again, it's a place we've talked about a lot, but for those of you who haven't had experienced any of our Brooklyn Army Terminal programs, this was built during World War I to serve as the main supply depot for American forces fighting in Europe. And it was designed by Cass Gilbert, same architect as the Woolworth building, although very, very different style. It's all reinforced concrete, very, very austere, designed to be built very, very quickly with no ornamentation. So the building is actually nearly as long as the Woolworth building is tall. It's about 980 feet long. And there's two of these warehouses. The one that's behind it that we can't see is even larger than the one that we see here in the foreground. And in total, it's 4 million square feet. So when it was built, it was the largest concrete building in the world. Unfortunately, it wasn't completed until September of 1919. So it never got to fulfill the role it was designed for in World War I, but it did in World War II, when it served as the headquarters for the New York port of embarkation. So when it was built, it was the largest Army military supply depot in the country. And it's often referred to as that through World War II, which is not true, actually. It was superseded by other facilities in World War II. Actually, it was superseded by the military supply depot in Ogden, Utah, which I learned recently. And we're actually trying to connect with the Historical Society out in Ogden to talk about that site. But anyway, so today, this building is now owned by the city of New York. It's run by the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And we have about 100 different companies, mostly manufacturing companies that occupy the space. And it is largely occupied. We have had some new space that was renovated in the last couple of years that has come online and is still looking for tenants. But the building is almost fully tenanted. And has about 4,000 people working there. Now, there are a number of companies in there that have done important work for the pandemic. There was a great article a couple of weeks ago in the LA Times about how the biotech incubator in the Army terminal called BioBat, one of their tenants called the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, or IAVI, actually made some important breakthroughs that helped to contribute to the creation of one of the COVID-19 vaccines. This is also a spot where you can get COVID-19 tested. So they have one of the rapid testing centers that's in the parking lot of the Army terminal. So when we've had to travel or go into quarantine, that's where we go to get our tests, because it's not too far from where we live in Brooklyn.
I love this shot, Doug. That's great to give us a great perspective on how far we've come from Manhattan. We'll see that again in a moment. But, Now, Andrew, do I recall correctly, was Irving Bush at all involved with the development of the Brooklyn Army Terminal?
He was, yeah. So he was actually in charge of something called the War Shipping Board. So he was basically responsible for managing all of the transportation assets of the military in New York Harbor. And so he was the one who advised building a large intermodal warehouse similar to what he had built in Bush Terminal. And they also built it just a couple of blocks away from his own complex, so they could actually sort of graft the Brooklyn Army Terminal onto the infrastructure that he had built with piers and railroads, but also building up a workforce. Now there was a large number of warehouse workers that lived in this neighborhood because of the Bush Terminal and other piers that were developed. So Irving T. Bush played a really, really big role in the creation of the Brooklyn Army Terminal. I will just mention here, we can see the pier on the left. That pier was similar to the piers we saw in that historical image of the Bush Terminal, in that it had a shed, a two-story shed that was on it. That was removed, as were the three other piers connected to the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So now we just have pier number 4 here, which you can see it's a municipal parking lot. This was also used throughout the pandemic as a drive-in movie theater by Rooftop Films, which is a tenant in the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So we had the opportunity to go and see a movie there once this summer. So it was pretty fun.
So we've only had one more stop on this route today. We've got a couple of fun things we're passing. I imagine we won't back up the whole way. We'll eventually continue heading southwest. But Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's in our picture, but we can't really make out right now.
So I'll pull up some images here. Yeah.
Go ahead with your images. So yeah, we're going to look at some of the infrastructure for moving freight. We've been talking about barges, and here we have a view from the expressway looking down at the float bridges with these trains going down the tracks and onto barges that have railroad tracks mounted on them. This is something we still do today, moving freight cars across New York Harbor to connect Long Island to New Jersey and beyond.
So Doug is right about out here where this barge is passing by, and we're looking from 2nd Avenue down onto the tracks. And yeah, the Brooklyn Army Terminal is a cool place to visit if you are interested in ships, but also if you're interested in trains, because we still have pretty active rail line that's here. And so yeah, what Stefan was referring to of these car floats, you can see right here, this is called the transfer bridge. And so this is where they actually drive those trains onto the barges or drive them off the barges onto land. And this is the last working transfer bridge in New York Harbor, right here. So here's a map. So give you a little primer on the freight rail infrastructure of the New York area. So I'm sure a lot of people, if you're a New Yorker, you have a pretty good grasp of the subway rail map, but maybe not so much the freight rail network. So we're down here right around 65th Street. And the challenge that we have in New York is that there's no freight rail bridge or tunnel that goes across the Hudson River or across the harbor. So if you want to get a train into Long Island or into New England, you either have to cross the river at Albany, or you can use this barge crossing right here. And so this will connect to all of those container terminals and other facilities over on the New Jersey side, as well as to the rail network of the rest of the country. And then on the Brooklyn side, you can see it connects up to the Long Island Railroad, and then up through the Hell Gate Bridge up into the Bronx and New England. So this is still a critical rail link that has also been upgraded in the last couple of years. So they've actually improved and expanded the capacity of that transfer bridge to take larger barges with more train cars on them.
And they're still talking, as they have been for 100 years, about building a tunnel, but we'll see if that happens.
That's right. That's right. So this is another example of, again, so much of our infrastructure that we don't think about, sort of the back office of the city, we find along the waterfront. And maybe, Doug, you can turn to the left for a second. I know the reception in this area isn't great. A little bit further. So you can see those sort of concrete structures back there. What is that we're looking at, Stefan?
Oh, we're looking at the Owl's Head wastewater treatment plant, vital link in our infrastructure here, treating wastewater from much of Brooklyn.
And you have had probably more experience with that facility than most people.
Yes, when one lives on a boat, as my colleague at the Waterfront Museum does, you have to be responsible with how you manage your sewage. And so we collect the sewage and dump it in the screens there. And that's an annual chore, but doing our part to keep the harbor clean.
Yeah. So yeah, you can't explore the waterfront of New York without looking at least one, if not many more wastewater treatment plants, and also seeing the transportation infrastructure that supports it, including the barges that are moving, treated or partially treated sewage from one plant to another, or for where it's going to go for final disposal. So again, you can see way in the distance there the skyline of Manhattan to see how far we've come. So you can actually, and you can see the Hudson Valley right there. So on the right-hand side, you have the skyline of Manhattan, and on the left-hand side, the skyline of Jersey City.
Yeah, no, I've heard the Hudson River described as a fjord because that glacier came down and carved that channel out. It's really creating that dramatic geography.
All right, so we're gonna let Doug get off the boat here. So I'm just gonna remove his his spotlight.
We promised to talk about Owl's Head Park. We mentioned Owl's
That's
Head
right.
wastewater treatment plant.
That's right. Yeah. So as Doug gets off the ferry, he's going to be at 69th Street in Bay Ridge, right on the edge of Owl's Head Park. And so there's not just a wastewater treatment plant. There's also a beautiful park. And what that was originally, it was actually developed as the estate of E.W. Bliss. So the sheet metal stamping magnate who had a number of factories across Brooklyn, including one right next to the Brooklyn Army Terminal, actually, up on 51st Street or 53rd Street. So anyway, when
like.
What's that?
I have to wonder what his commute was like.
Yeah. I didn't have to go very far, but he built this estate, which I'll show an image of. Oh, here we can see one of the car floats, but this was his estate. And so he actually bequeathed it to the city of New York. And after a long court battle with his widow, who didn't necessarily want to give up the property, it was eventually taken by the city of New York, but they did knock down all of the buildings. So you can see this sort of Victorian folly castle over here and the main manor house up there. Those are all gone. But it's still this beautiful green space in Bay Ridge that offers wonderful views of Manhattan, but also of the Narrows. So it's a great spot to go if you want to see ships coming up the Narrows into the harbor.
Absolutely, yeah. Sat up there to watch Upsail 2000, the big gathering of tall ships.
Yeah. Great. So Doug, it looks like, is just getting off the boat, but before we go, we have a couple minutes left. If anybody has any other questions before we go, this has been a lot of fun, Stefan. And like we said, as we were getting ready to go on air, we said we have 100 things to talk about, and we'll probably get to about a quarter of them, and that was certainly the case. So we didn't get to cover everything you wanted to, but yeah, let us know if you have any questions, and then we're just going to cut to Doug for a second, who's going to give us a sign off. He's on the 69th Street Pier. Which has historically been a ferry pier, again, a place where you used to be able to take the ferry to go back and forth to Staten Island before they built the Verrazano Bridge.
Yeah, if you're in St. George and looking at the terminal there, you can see a little building off to the side of the St. George terminal if you're down where the cars used to come in, and it still says ferry to Brooklyn for 69th Street.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to unmute you, Doug.
All right. Hi, everybody. So
all right.
we made it.
Are you frozen solid?
A little bit cold, yeah, but I had gloves on, so it was all good. It's all good. Kind of an exciting ride, actually. But that's, I don't know if you can see, you can see beautiful clouds in the background there. But
yeah. Matthew had a question here about Bay Ridge. We can share a little bit more about it. I mean, from a waterfront perspective, Bay Ridge is interesting because it's kind of where the working waterfront ends, right? Yeah, it was, 65th Street was sort of the end. Brooklyn Army Terminal is sort of the southernmost extent of that working waterfront. And so you'll see a sort of a smooth shoreline, which has been made only smoother by the construction of the Bay Parkway. But yeah, so what's interesting is that there didn't used to be this sort of barrier between what Sunset Park and Bay Ridge. They were actually considered more of a cohesive neighborhood, but the construction of those highways sort of sequestered it, cut it off, similar to what happened to Red Hook. Red Hook and Carroll Gardens used to be much more connected neighborhoods, but the BQE sort of, cut off that appendage. So Bay Ridge in some ways has become more separated from Sunset Park in that way.
Some things have remained the same in Bay Ridge. Historically, this waterfront, once you get past the working waterfront, this area had, big athletic clubs and boat houses, and was a popular place for recreation. It was a wealthy area. The shore used to have huge houses on it. The Gold Coast, one of many places called the Gold Coast, and you still see large houses on overlooking the water on the edge of Bay Ridge. But other parts of Bay Ridge have changed significantly. It's a very diverse neighborhood. I used to live there for a while. I know, Andrew, it's a favorite neighborhood of yours. Great place to eat, and lots of great cultural things there. Middle Eastern, Italian, Irish, a couple little vestiges of its Norwegian heritage, not just Leif Erikson Park. Great place to visit.
Yeah, and so there's still, I got to mention the Norwegian heritage because I have some family members who grew up in Bay Ridge who are Norwegian. They still host the 17th of May parade, which is Norwegian Constitution Day. So that's sort of a big cultural event. But there aren't so many places to get Scandinavian food anymore in the neighborhood, but it's a fantastic place to get all sorts of Middle Eastern food, Yemeni food, Lebanese food, Egyptian food. It's Palestinian food.
Yep.
It's a great place to visit for that, along 3rd Avenue and along 5th Avenue. And of course, as you go further up the hill, 8th Avenue over on the Sunset Park side is the second largest Chinatown in New York City. So it's actually larger than the Chinatown in Manhattan, but dwarfed by where you live in Flushing.
That's right. That's right. We've got lots of great mentions in the chat. Yes, Janet Yellen is from Bay Ridge, and of course, Bay Ridge then is relatively contiguous with the Fort Hamilton neighborhood, where you get memories of Saturday Night Fever, and and this time of year, people know Bay Ridge because it's the closest subway stop to the Diker lights, the incredible Christmas light displays just across the expressway in Diker Heights.
And Amy also mentioned that it is the birthplace of Century 21.
Local, well-known local store.
We've lost a lot in the pandemic, even just talking frivolously about, places to eat and shop, because obviously people have lost tremendously in the pandemic, but we've lost so many small local businesses, but I will definitely feel the loss of Century 21. Of the very rare clothes shopping that I do, Century 21 was always a great, very cheap and convenient place to go, and very helpful people who work there as well. So Doug's just taking a little wander around the pier. Again, if you have any other questions, we'll keep going if people keep asking questions, but we don't want to make people feel like you're obligated to stay on. We also have a little, the Eco Dock is here at 69th Street, right? Right, Stefan?
That is how they refer to the pier these days. I am not sure exactly. I have not noticed a lot of infrastructure relating to ecology there, but it's I think a lot of what I've noticed at that pier and when I've lived there and in more recent visits is they do have infrastructure for vessels. I remember back in 2005 when the MTA went on strike, the Staten Island Ferry docked at 69th Street to get people to Bay Ridge, to the hinterlands of Brooklyn when the subway was down. So yeah, it's part of the resilience of our city is infrastructure like this on the waterfront.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining. Doug, we can see there in the distance the Verrazano Bridge. That's another nice thing to do. There's a bike and pedestrian path that runs from 69th Street all the way down underneath the Verrazano. That's always where I go to watch the Fleet Week ships coming in. You can also see Fort Hamilton right underneath the bridge. And along the way too, speaking of environmental education, there are some nice interpretive panels that are put up by the New York Aquarium in Coney Island. So nice place to take a walk and get some of the ocean breeze. So Doug, we'll see your face or your masked face for a moment here.
All right, everybody.
Hey, thank you so much. Big round of applause for Doug.
No, you guys, thank you so much. Great to hear all the stories again from the waterfront. Such a beautiful trip. And the ferries run all winter long, and there are inside cabins, and it's a really great way to see the city. I took this, I think the second ferry departure back when they started a couple of years ago. I made my way out there, so they're a really important part of the city's infrastructure and a great way to see the city on a budget. You can really see a lot from the water.
Yeah,
Yep.
great. Well, thank you all so much. We'll probably do another installment of this ferry series. We might wait until it gets a little bit warmer. But thank you all so much. Join us if you want to join our little book club. You can. Tonight at 5 o'clock is our member happy hour. Then tomorrow we're going to be exploring how to pick out the perfect Christmas tree with the Urban Garden Center. And then we have programming throughout the month of December and the holiday season. So please join us at turnstiletours.com. Thank you all so much for your support and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Doug. And thank you,
Bye-bye,
Cindy.
guys.